Welcome to this week's episode of the Unwound podcast. I'm delighted that this week we're joined by Jamie Akers, a wonderful guitarist, lutenist, theorbist, and various other things. He's worked with a lot of the finest musicians in the early music field, and more recently he has been devoting quite a lot of his time and energy to rare composers for the guitar from various Eastern European countries, cultures, a big treasure chest of repertoire that's pretty much unexplored until now. So, Jamie, thanks very much for coming on to this podcast to speak a little bit about it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Could you tell us a little bit about how you discovered this repertoire?
Sure. A few years ago, I bought on eBay, funnily enough, a nine-string guitar, an original sort of 1880s nine-string guitar. And initially, I just played some of the usual stuff on it. But then I got to thinking, why has it got the nine strings? What are these extra bass strings for? You can just play the usual stuff and add some extra notes. And I knew that certain composers like Costa and Mertz, I've read that they played seven string, eight string, with more extended range instruments. So that got me digging around for music specifically composed for eight, nine, 10 string guitar. In that process of exploration, I came across various names of composers, all of them heading eastwards. So I think if we take, because I guess initially these extended range guitars date from the early to mid 19th century, and Stauffer, the Viennese luthier traditions, they were Schmerzer, Stauffer, they were the ones creating the instruments. So that led me to these Eastern European sources of music, which were, funnily enough, when from your introduction, as you do say that this music isn't widely explored, but funnily enough, it's not that hard to find. It's in various manuscript collections. A lot of it's on the Boyi website. It's not difficult, but I think perhaps the extended range or just the unfamiliarity of the names. And another problem is the language barrier, because a lot of it's in Cyrillic, the Cyrillic alphabet. So obviously for me it was quite impenetrable. So I think there's a few reasons why it's not been explored. But I say it wasn't an Indiana Jones thing. I wasn't digging around in mines with a bullwhip. It's fairly easy to come across.
In terms of the whole nine string thing, eight string, seven string, I think it's worth pointing out to people, and you can expand on this a little bit, that prior to the late 19th century, the amount of strings on a guitar was much more, it was more free, wasn't it? I mean, it was less standardized. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I would go a stage further, and I would say the standardization really didn't occur until well into the 20th century. For me, the key moment is when Segovia visits Hauser, and Hauser, because if you look at Hermann Hauser's guitars prior to that, he was building 8/9. He was building these Stauffer tradition types of extended range instruments. It was then, I think, for me, that's the turning point really. Two things: Segovia visiting Russia, and then Segovia in visiting Hauser, meeting Hauser, and that's when it becomes standardized. So really, to me, not until the 1920s. But yeah, prior to that, obviously, talking about Eastern Europe, I think we need to firstly distinguish that what I've been playing is not the Russian guitar. It's not the seven string Russian guitar, which has its own tradition, Sichra and Vysotsky and those composers, which has been reasonably well explored by, Oleg Timofeyev and John Schneiderman in the modern era. So it's not that. It's not the Russian guitar. So it's
just before,
standard tuning.
before you go on, just explain to people what the Russian guitar is. I know it's not what you're playing in the music we're going to discuss, but just explain a little bit for
Yeah,
people who
so
are unaware of that.
so from the late 18th century in Russia, a variation on the guitar, what we would call a romantic guitar, came into being. The origins of which are not entirely clear, but they ended up, and the principal architect of this is the composer Andrei Sichra, who's a Czech composer who ended up in Russia, and they created this, well, as a seven string guitar. So it's got a completely different tuning. It's tuned to a G major chord, basically. So it's like an open tuning, starting on the dominant, going D to D, and it has its own, I say, it has its own tradition, its own culture, and it was hugely popular from about 1800. Well, as a classical instrument. That's another thing maybe to distinguish here, because it later on became associated as the kind of the gypsy guitar. It's sometimes referred to as that, but it had this long classical tradition from about 1800 to 1880. And I would say, in terms of sheer output and quality of music, it's really up there. I mean, it's the if you get a chance to listen to some of Sekhra's best pieces, they are very high standard. So that instrument was popular in Russia at that time, certainly until 1850. It was as popular as the guitar in Western Europe. But I think because of the tuning and the number of strings, and again the language barrier, it didn't really filter out throughout Europe.
That's fascinating. So, I mean, how much of a connection is there between that and the repertoire you're playing? I know it's obviously for a different tuning, but you mentioned that the Russian guitar has its own distinctive tradition. With the repertoire that you're about to introduce, is that much closer to what we might think of as the Western tradition of Mertz and composers like that?
I think it lies in between. It's a really interesting question because the materials they're working with and the style of composition, yeah, Mertz, you can see a lot of parallels with Mertz. Uh, there are some overlaps also with the Russian tradition. So there's occasionally you get arrangements of each other's pieces. So, for example, there are arrangements by Sekhra of pieces by Giuliani and Sor, and there are arrangements by Klinger, one of the composers I dealt with, who writes for an 8-string guitar. There are arrangements he made of some of Sekhra's compositions. So there is overlap at this stage. And we should remember, Sor went to Russia, and the Souvenir de Russe and all that, so, and the two melodies that Sor used were popular Russian tunes, were widely used by Russian composers as well for variation sets. So it's not like these are hermetically sealed and uninfluencing each other, but at the same time, I think they have their own unique paths that they take.
Great, it's super interesting, and I mean, I'm sure that people listening to this will want to go and explore some of that repertoire already, the stuff you've mentioned already, both the Russian guitar and the Eastern European repertoire that we're about to hear. Um, so you discovered this repertoire, and you play a lot of it. I mean, you've recorded, at least
Two albums, yeah.
two albums of this repertoire. The first album has a a range of composers from that tradition. Can you talk a little bit about that and talk about the composers and the what's distinctive about the cultures that they may have come from?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, so their album you refer to is called Fantasie Romantique. Has a French title because obviously everybody spoke French in the 19th century. And yeah, it does have a range of composers, including sort of well-known composers. So there's a piece by Mertz, but then other composers are obviously less well-known. It begins with a piece by Polupayenko, who was a and what we to set the scene. I think if we look at the Russian Empire at the time, it's very different societally from the rest of Europe. So there's not a bourgeois culture. It's still a feudal system. You have an emperor, a nobility, and a load of peasants, right? So there's not the bourgeois market for music making that there was in Western Europe, which funded. So you don't have people buying tons of sheet music. You don't have people going to concerts in the same way. You don't have concerts where people buy a ticket. If there's a concert, it's because a nobleman has put on a concert in his dacha. So it's a very different culture. So most of the composers from there, based there, were not professional composers. In the same way that Borodin and Mussorgsky and the mighty handful, Tsui, they were all otherwise employed. They couldn't be composers. So Pulupiyanko was a doctor by profession, and he published quite a few pieces, many of them based on sort of folk melodies he heard and things. So that was sort of standard practice. You take traditional tunes and arrange them. He was best buddies with the next composer on the album called Johann Decker-Schenk, who he was German actually. Again, because of this society in Russia, a lot of people were imported. So composers like John Fields, the pianist, lived and worked in Russia. Sohr, as we said already, went to Russia. So Decker-Schenk ended up in Russia. He's originally an opera singer. He's a little bit like the Lignani of the East. He was originally an opera singer and impresario who in later life turned his attention to writing and teaching for the guitar. So there's a couple of pieces by him on the album. Makarov. Now Makarov, who's another composer, was a composer and lexicographer. Is that the word? Dictionary person. He wrote, I think, the standard Russian-German dictionary. Because again, Russian, the language, was not codified until much later than all other languages. So he was a big influence in that. So Makarov, however, was the other end of the spectrum. He was a nobleman. He was massively wealthy, had huge estates in the grasslands, and he there used that wealth. So you may know the story of the famous guitar building and composing competition that took place, where Mertz, who'd already died, won the competition and Costa came second, right? If you know of that story, Makarov was the funder of that. It was Makarov who set it up because he wanted to get to know all these composers and he used his wealth to have an in with them. So that's Makarov, and he wrote his music's very flashy, show-offy. He wants to prove that he's the man. Now, there's also a composer who sounds Italian. He's sort of modern, sort of second division, well-known composer.
Yeah, I wondered about him. Yeah.
Yeah, well, Pettoletti, although he sounds Italian, was actually Swedish, I think. He born in Sweden, ended up also in Russia. And he's an interesting case because he was one who worked both with the seven-string guitar, the Russian guitar, and the standard tuning guitar. So he did a bit of both. He learned to play one when he arrived in Russia, so he could maximize. But he's another of these foreigners who was imported and subsidized to lend glamour and prestige to a household there. The last composer on this disc is Pavlistchev, who perhaps culturally is the most interesting because he was the brother-in-law of the poet Pushkin. So he was very much part of that cultural milieu. So when you sort of say, how are these guys all connected? Quite closely in some respects, and certainly Pavlistchev. And he's a fascinating character because he's also a very capable composer, but he's also a very capable administrator. And being a nobleman, you had a certain degree of freedom, but on the other hand, he was obliged to do administrative work for the state. So he ended up being an overseer. He ended up being a kind of a regional what would you call him, like the burgomaster or something, the mayor of some regional town. So there's one bit where he laments. He says, he just wants to devote his life to composing and playing the guitar, but he can't because he's just been posted to some, to Vladivostok to run the council. So, yeah, and so they're a very disparate group of individuals, but somehow connected. And I guess more importantly for us, connected by the fact that they produced and published various amounts of guitar music for standard tune guitar as well that we can play.
Oh, there's a lot in that. You've anticipated one of my questions, which was going to be how much do these composers interact with the wider culture? But clearly, they are very much from within that that broader culture.
I think so, and for me, that's true of the across the board the guitar culture of the 19th century. Even though in a modern sense, classical guitar is seen as a little bit of a ghetto. I think at that time, figures like Sor and Giuliani were mainstream. Just to take it into the Western Europe for a minute, Sor was famed as a ballet composer. Giuliani, was really integral in the Vienna music scene.
Yeah.
So I think it's unfortunate that in the modern sense, guitar has been slightly sidelined, whereas I think then it was very much a mainstream
It
instrument.
has, and I mean, we could venture into slightly dangerous territory here, in that I mean, one of the ironies, perhaps, of Segovia was that his success, or at least his kind of personal story that went along with his success and his artistic personality or persona, was that the guitar had been nothing before. Or virtually nothing. Yeah, there was the odd beautiful piece by Saur and the odd little thing here by Giuliani, but basically it was completely sidelined, not much of a tradition really of any value. And he was going to correct all of that. And of course, as you've just suggested, perhaps the opposite has happened in some ways. So,
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, what I'd say in Segovia's defense um, is that I think he just wasn't aware of a lot of stuff. Because what I'm saying about how I've been doing this stuff, right? If someone like me can find a bunch of music that no one else has played, and Segovia didn't have the internet. Remember, he was born in the 1890s, so all Segovia knew was what you're saying: the little bits of Giuliani saw, the pieces that had remained in print since the day of the composer's lives, which were the pieces published by the big publishers, which were generally either student works for beginners or serious, more serious upper, like Giuliani Sonata or something, see more serious works. But there was a lot he didn't know. So you think Segovia didn't know about Mertz, he didn't know about, lots of composers. Rigondi even. I mean, although that's borderline debatable what he knew about Rigondi, but these. I mean, and a figure like Rigondi, who now I think is seen as being a seriously important figure, as you just discussed previously, um, it was unknown to him. So that would be my defense of Segovia. Where I would agree with you, I think, is the fact that Segovia was an inveterate self mythologizer, and he was of his time, and at that time the belief was that the great men of history who forged their path.
yes,
So
and
I
he was
think
going to be that great man for the guitar. Yeah. And
exactly.
also, I would say that in what I said, I wasn't actually. I think it's important you made that, very, that qualification, because I wasn't meaning to suggest that Segovia was somehow being mendacious in his in his personal story. As you say, that's all he knew, and he very much came out of the guitar as a Spanish instrument, the tradition that, in a way, had been started by people like Tárrega a little bit before, and of course that was their own compositions, quite Spanish sounding, and then arrangements of music by Beethoven, Mozart, little kind of little miniatures and single movements of sonatas and that thing, and that's what he had to go on. So no, it's
Yeah,
not to accuse him of anything really, but it's just to say that it's perhaps one of the accidents of history is. And it ties in with what you said before about the guitar being standardized as the six-string Spanish instrument. Um, and that's, anyway,
yeah, no, I
luckily that's
agree,
been
and that's
corrected now
part.
by people like you. So,
Well, I mean, you say that. What strikes me always is someone like me, who's I'm not. I know my place in the firmament. I'm just a sort of interested. I'm not famous. I'm not David Russell. I'm not one of these guys. So what perturbs me and intrigues me is why it's me doing this and not somebody more prominent. Because if people are always looking for new repertoire, and I'm always surprised whenever I come across, when I was working on this stuff, I'm like looking for recordings of this music. I'm like, okay, there must be, what must be a recording of this somewhere, and there wasn't. I was like, and I'm still waiting. I'm still waiting for someone to spring this on me. It's like, no, what are you doing, you idiot? Someone's been doing this for years. But it just seems strange to me that this is there and so easily found and graspable, but it's not been grasped until now by me. who's, obviously not winning the big competitions or touring the world.
Well, there were no recordings, as you said, but there are now, which is which is great. So we're going to hear a little bit of one of them, the first recording, the Fantasie Romantique, and which piece are we going to hear from
So I
that?
think
That's quite
you're gonna play the Ukrainische Weise, which is by Deckerschenk, who was talking about earlier. Obviously, Ukrainische Weise is German, obviously, and it means way, but it can also mean melody. So it's just Ukrainian melody. And yeah, so it's quite a nice story that Dekharchenko and Polupiyenko, the two composers I mentioned, annually toured in the 1890s. They did an annual tour through Ukraine, or what is now Ukraine, what was then part of the Russian Empire. So, and both of them, the pieces I recorded, Polupiyenko's one is the Fantasia on Zaporizhzhia themes. So Zaporizhzhia is the Cossack region of Ukraine, and then this is the Ukrainische Weise by Dekharchenko. So I think it's not an original folk melody, but it's Dekharchenk's take on the folk tradition and sounds of the Ukrainian music making.
wonderful. Well, let's hear that now. Well, that was Ukrainische Weise by Decker Schenk from Jamie Akers' wonderful album Fantasie Romantique, a collection of rare pieces by composers from the Eastern European tradition. Many of them ended up in Russia in the course of their lives. A beautiful piece, and if you want to hear more of music like that, I strongly recommend buying the album. It's beautiful. Uh, so you've done that album. You've also done an album devoted entirely to Klinger, one composer from this tradition. Can you tell us a bit about him? Why Klinger? I mean, why does he get the album all to himself?
Yeah, no, that's I ask myself that. So Klinger again, it was another of these. I'd say amateur. I mean, amateur in the best possible sense. Amateur composer in that in his working life, he was a military. He was a soldier, and which isn't uncommon, funnily enough, in the guitar business. There are others. Moretti, for example, who was famed for having, worked out the best notation for guitar. He was also a captain in the military. So, and I think it's Sor at some point, perhaps as well. So, anyway, Dekershenk was a military officer in the Russian Imperial Army. He's a footnote in a couple of aspects of history because he's actually a bit of a historical figure because he relating to his military escapades because at one point he was captured when the Russian Empire was forming, they invaded Chechnya and he was captured by Chechen soldiers and so he was a prisoner of war and he kept a journal of his life as a prisoner of war, which is a major historical source for Chechen culture in the modern era. So that was his first footnote in history. At a certain point, he was invalided out of the army and devoted the rest of his life to guitar playing and composing. And the reason I'm devoted a disc to him was because I couldn't decide which of his pieces were to be included in the overall package, So the overall package was to give an overview and say, here's some nice stuff. But Klinger, the quality of his music and the breadth of it and the range of it, just, I think he's really one of the better, certainly his style is quite unique and there's not a bad piece in there. I recorded a fairly hefty amount of his output, and even that was tricky to whittle it down because you're just like, oh, I'm going to lose this or that. So he's really, I think, well worth looking at. And actually, having said that about extended range and multiple strings, quite a lot of his stuff is just for 6 string. He does write for 8 as well, but
Yeah, I was gonna ask about that. So I'm glad you said that. So yeah. So basically,
it's
anybody with a normal guitar can check this
anyone with a
repertoire out.
normal guitar can check it out. And he does some really, you know, unique textural things. This his harmonic sense is really nice. Really, always on the right side of adventurous. He does interesting things and in an interesting way. The one of the fascinating things he does is, and I think you will hear that if you when in the piece we'll play later, is he does these balalaika impressions. So he has these moments in the piece where, and he describes it. He says, in the style of a balalaika. Now that might seem something a bit silly, like these kind of rasgueados in classical guitar pieces or something. But in actual fact, the instrument, the balalaika, there is no written record or no surviving records of what it was prior to about 1880 or something. It's a real kind of mystery. And there's all these things saying so and so picked up the balalaika and played a tune, but what did that mean? It was only later in the 1880s where they slightly fabricated a folk culture based around this instrument, And so you see that you think the balalaika is going to be this really ancient thing that goes back to the 15th century or something, but in actual fact, it's quite a recent. The form it has now is quite a recent invention. And obviously that sort of triangle shape it's like some kind of prototype Flying V or something. And I think that's kind of why it's very recognizable. So it was only sort of became into its modern form in the 1880s, and then I think when the Soviets then decided to create a folk culture, because if you think of these kind of the Soviets, the state folk orchestra or whatever, right? Again, they're if you they're taking a mixture of sort of famous classical pieces, and it's not really a folk tradition. They're basically creating it out of from nothing and taking some of these instruments. But the so Klinger's notation of what a balalaika would have sounded like is actually the earliest example of what a balalaika might have sounded like, what it would have been played. So it has a certain musicological significance beyond the fact it sounds quite cool on the guitar.
Yeah. Oh, that is amazing. Well, I'm learning so much from this. I'm sure the listeners are too. Uh, you keep anticipating my questions. I was going to ask, of course, about the balalaika thing. I was going to ask that after we had the piece. But there you go. A huge amount to ponder as well there about the origins of the balalaika, perhaps being not the balalaika, maybe even the guitar.
Yeah, well, that's one of those sort of imponderables about history. The Soviets chose the balalaika as the instrument to project the image of Russia, right? And again, I think it's just because it looked different from anything else. If I had been Stalin's chief of propaganda, I would have chosen the guitar because it was equally as significant. And then, you might have had a rival to this sort of Spanish tradition at that point. But because of, a little twists of fate, it resulted in the idea of the Eastern European, the Russian guitar faded from view, and the Spanish obviously took the fore.
Well, fascinating. Well, let's hear Fate Untwisted now. And Jamie, could you tell us? I couldn't resist. I'll keep it in along with Indiana Jones. Could you introduce the piece that we're going to hear from the Klinger album?
Although Fate Untwisted sounds like a great name for a rock band, I
Yeah,
have to
it
say.
does. We can play Flying V Balalaika imitation.
Brilliant. So yeah, this is Ivan Klinger's Opus 17. So it's a Fantasia on three themes. And we're actually just going to hear the middle section, which is based on a folk song called Do Not Wake Me Up. And I chose this as being quite representative of Klinger's style because it is a traditional Russian folk song. You can hear that Slavic quality to it, the minor key and the movement, the melody. It has one of his balalaika impressions, and it's a really fun one. He really gets the tune,
It
and then
really is.
there's and you can I think it just gives an idea of the variety of textures he goes for, because we get the balalaika, then we get a kind of pedal note thing, and he just gives a range of textures that he can achieve. It's not his most harmonically adventurous one, but I thought it just gave a nice overview. So that's why I thought that would be a fun one to play on this occasion. And also, just as a little aside, what I think it also demonstrates is the huge importance of gypsy music to just Eastern European music making generally. I think a lot of the the idea of these gypsy performers who are very virtuosic, lots of tempo changes, lots of excitement, that I think influenced composers like Brahms and Liszt, I think is also influential here. And if there's one thing that I think connects this with the Spanish, it's that influence of like the Roma. So you do hear things where you're like, oh, that sounds a bit like something a little bit Tárrega or something, Spanish nationalist. And I think that's where it's coming from. Something underpinning this is that, the gypsy tradition of flamboyant and very minor, very dark and exciting music making.
So let's hear that now. This is the middle section of the Fantasy in Three Themes by Klinger from Jamie Akers' album devoted entirely to that composer. So that was the Fantasy on Three Themes by Klinger, played beautifully by Jamie Akers. Jamie, before we wrap up, could I just ask you about the title of that album, The Poor Branch? What does that refer to?
Yeah, absolutely. The Poor Branch is one of the songs that Klinger writes variations on. It's the last track on the album. So the original is a sort of sentimental song by Nikolai Titov, is a composer, and it's about a branch of a tree that is falls a branch that falls off the tree and is swept off to sea, never to be seen again. So it's a kind of a sentimental, allegorical story. Um, to me, the reason I chose that particular title was just because it seemed to me, in addition to it's a nice tune and the sentimental song that it comes from, it just seemed to me that this branch of guitar repertoire, in a way that has been so neglected, it's like the poor branch of the guitar business, because it's taken so long for it to be recognized, well, by me of all people. So that's what it was, really. I just felt like it seemed to sum up the project as an entirety, and it's, in a way, it's historical place, if that doesn't sound too pompous.
No, not at all. I think it's a very apt title, actually. Well, it's been really fascinating. I've learned a huge amount. I'm actually itching to get my hands on some of this repertoire myself, partly because it's just played so beautifully by you on these two albums. And so I do urge everybody who's listened to this podcast to check these albums out. You can, of course, stream them on Spotify, as is almost always the case now. But of course, you can also get hard copies you can buy.
Yeah, you can buy them from resonance.com as the record label. They're all
Okay, good, and that'll all be linked in the description box. So check it out. Jamie, what else have you got going on at the moment?
Well, you know what? I've been working really hard for a while, and so I'm sort of between projects. I'm off to America. I'm off to Chicago beginning of next month to perform a little bit there, to play some of this Eastern European repertoire. I think the next big project I've got lined up is going to be, I did a few years ago an album of forte piano and guitar pieces by Diabelli, the Carulli, Giuliani, those pieces. I think, and that was using an original Erard forte piano with some original guitar. So I think we're going to revisit some of that next year and maybe record. The curious thing was, you might find this slightly surprising, but when we recorded the pieces we recorded some Carulli, Giuliani, Diabelli, Moscheles, and at the time I thought the Carulli pieces would be kind of filler and the big works were the Diabelli and the Giuliani. But on reflection and listening, the Carulli pieces were extremely effective. So I think in some respects he's a subtle composer. He maybe was a bit overactive, and if he'd had an editor, he could have been a greater composer. But we're going to explore some. I think maybe record a disc devoted to Carulli's piano and forte piano and guitar pieces, all on original instruments.
That's super. It sounds great. So we'll look forward to that very much. Well, Jamie, thanks very much for joining us for this episode of Unwound. It's been a hugely instructive one. And to listeners, thanks very much for tuning in. I hope to see you again next time. If you want to check out Jamie's work, follow the links below to his website and to the albums. If you enjoyed this podcast and want to support it in some ways, you can follow the links below to that as well. But until the next time, all the best.